60 quinqueremes came into the harbor of Syracuse in the summer of 213 before the Common Era, the heaviest warships in the Mediterranean, oars beating in unison, decks packed with legionaries who had crushed Carthage's armies in the field. The Roman fleet arrived with the confidence of men who had never lost. At their head was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a consul of Rome, a man Rome itself would later call the sword of the state. He expected the siege to last weeks. He had brought scaling ladders lashed across the hulls of 8 ships bound together, a floating siege tower he called the sambuca, engineered to lift men straight onto the seawalls. He had done the arithmetic. Syracuse had walls, yes, but Rome had numbers, and numbers had always been enough. Picture it from the deck of the flagship. The admirals watched the seawall grow closer and saw exactly what they expected to see. Stone, low and old, and no fleet coming out to meet them. The rowers found their rhythm. Officers called the assault troops to their positions, and then, along the top of the wall, a beam of timber swung out over the battlements, and from the end of it, a length of chain came down, and men on the nearest ship began to shout. A rope crested the parapet where there should have been nothing, and a line of legionaries who had never broken in the field took a step back from the rail. Something on that wall was reaching for them, and no one aboard could see a single hand working it. What Marcellus had not accounted for was a 70-year-old man who had never commanded a soldier in his life. Within the first day, one of his 8-ship siege engines would be lifted out of the water by a beam of timber and dropped back into the sea. Within weeks, Roman soldiers would flinch at the sight of a rope appearing over the battlements. So how did a single mathematician defending a city Rome outnumbered and outgunned force the most powerful army on earth to stop attacking altogether and simply sit down and wait? Here is exactly what I am going to walk you through. The first thing is the specific engineering flaw in the Roman assault plan that Archimedes identified before a single ship arrived, and how he turned the harbor itself into the trap. The second thing is the machine the Romans called the claw, the iron grappling arm that reached down over the walls, seized warships by the prow, and capsized them, and the exact mechanical principle that let one operator lift a warship. The third thing is the truth about the so-called burning mirrors, the story that Archimedes set Roman ships on fire with focused sunlight, and what the physical evidence actually says happened at the waterline. The fourth thing is the 2-tier wall system of catapults, the near-range and far-range batteries that meant there was no distance at which a Roman soldier was safe. And the fifth thing is the single failure that finally cracked Syracuse after nearly 3 years, a failure that had nothing to do with any of Archimedes' machines, and why the empire that lost here walked away with the lesson that would let it conquer everything after. Rome studied this defeat and rewrote its siege doctrine around it. And I will show you the quiet order Marcellus gave about the old man the moment the walls fell. A word on where this account comes from, because the story of Syracuse has been told badly for 2,000 years. The core of what we know comes from 3 ancient historians: Polybius, a Greek writer working within a generation or two of the siege, who had access to Roman military records and whose account is the earliest and most sober; Plutarch, who wrote his life of Marcellus roughly 3 centuries later and preserved the vivid detail; and Livy, the Roman historian who gives us the Roman side and its frustration. Where these 3 agree, the ground is solid. Where they diverge, and on the burning mirrors especially they diverge sharply, I will tell you exactly where the record splits and what the engineering allows. To understand why Marcellus was so confident, you have to understand what Rome had just done. This was the Second Punic War. Hannibal had crossed the Alps and was loose in Italy, and the war had spread outward like a crack across glass. Sicily was the pivot. Whoever held Sicily held the grain and the sea lanes between Italy and Africa. Syracuse, on the island's eastern coast, was the greatest city in Sicily and one of the greatest in the Greek world, and for decades it had been Rome's ally under an old king named Hero. Then Hero died. His young grandson took the throne, listened to the wrong advisors, and swung the city toward Carthage. To Rome, that was not a diplomatic shift. That was a knife held at the throat of the entire Western war. So Rome sent Marcellus, and Marcellus came with a plan that had worked against every city he had ever faced: a combined assault. The army would press the landward walls with siege engines and ladders, while the fleet struck the seaward walls from the harbor, where the fortifications were lower and, in the Roman assessment, weaker. He built the sambuca, that ship-mounted siege ladder, precisely for the sea assault. The idea was elegant. You lash the ships together for stability, you raise the covered ladder, you drop your assault troops onto the parapet before the defenders can concentrate. Marcellus expected to overwhelm the walls from two directions at once within the first week. Polybius tells us the Romans were so sure of a quick storming that they mocked the very idea that a city defended by geometry could resist a city defended by legions. What Marcellus did not know was that the geometry had been waiting for him for years. Inside Syracuse was Archimedes. By the time the Roman fleet appeared, he was already in his 70s, the most celebrated mathematician in the world, a man who had spent his life on problems that had nothing to do with war. The area of a parabola, the relationship between a sphere and the cylinder that contains it, the value of pi, which he pinned between two fractions with a precision no one would improve on for centuries. He was not a general. He held no command. But old King Hiero, years before, had asked him a practical question, and that question had quietly turned the greatest theoretical mind of the ancient world into the greatest military engineer of the ancient world. The mechanism that made Syracuse impregnable begins with a single idea that Archimedes understood better than any person alive. The idea was mechanical advantage. "Give me a place to stand," he is supposed to have told King Hiero, "and I will move the earth." That was not a boast about magic. It was a statement about levers and pulleys, about the compound pulley system he had refined, in which a small force applied over a long distance is traded for an enormous force applied over a short one. Hiero had once challenged him to prove it. Archimedes had a fully loaded merchant ship dragged out of the water and up onto dry land, a ship that ordinarily took a full crew of men straining together to move. According to the account, Archimedes sat calmly at a distance, worked a system of ropes and pulleys with his own hand, and drew the loaded ship smoothly up the beach, as though it were gliding through water. Hiero was so struck that he asked Archimedes to build the defenses of the city, and Archimedes spent years doing exactly that, not as a rush job when the enemy appeared, but as a slow, deliberate design of the walls of Syracuse as a single, integrated weapon. That is the detail almost every retelling misses. Archimedes did not improvise machines under siege. He engineered the fortifications of Syracuse in advance so that the walls, the harbor, and the machines were one system. He knew the Romans would attack from the sea because the seawalls looked lower and weaker. He knew the sambuca would have to come in close to reach the parapet. And he built the harbor defenses specifically to punish a ship the moment it entered a certain range. When Marcellus sailed his lashed-together assault ships toward the seawall, he was not exploiting a weakness. he was sailing into the exact kill zone that a 70-year-old geometer had marked out on a diagram years before he arrived. Now, the claw. Of all the machines at Syracuse, this is the one that reads like legend, and it is the one the engineering most solidly supports. Polybius describes it plainly, and Polybius was not a man given to fantasy. Along the seawall, Archimedes had mounted a row of great beams that projected out over the battlements, swung on pivots so they could be turned and lowered. From the end of each beam hung a heavy iron grappling device on a chain, what the Romans came to call the iron hand. When a Roman ship pressed in close to the wall, the operators inside the fortification would swing the beam out over it and drop the iron hand onto the vessel. The claw would seize the ship, usually by the prow, and then the same compound pulley principle that had dragged the merchant ship up the beach was thrown into reverse. Men inside the wall hauled down on the far end of the beam. The prow of the warship was wrenched upward, lifted clean out of the water until the ship stood on its stern. And then they released it. Think about what that does to a quinquereme. A vessel like this likely displaced on the order of tens of tons, and now it is suddenly hoisted by the bow, hangs vertical for a moment, sailors sliding and falling from the deck, and then the grip lets go. The ship crashes down. Sometimes it slammed back stern first and swamped. Sometimes it was dropped sideways and rolled over. Sometimes, Polybius says, the claw shook the ship until men were flung from it and dashed against the rocks, and then dropped the emptied hull. To the Roman crews, it was as if the wall itself had reached down and grabbed them. There was no enemy to fight, no line to break. There was a beam of timber, a length of chain, and an iron hand, and no visible person doing the work, because the men who worked the pulleys were behind the wall, safe, hauling on ropes. And this is where the mechanism becomes genuinely brilliant rather than merely dramatic. The claw did not need a strong man. It needed a well-designed pulley system. The whole point of Archimedes' compound pulley was that force multiplied through enough sheaves could let a handful of operators lift a load no crowd of men could shift by direct pull. So the machine was not limited by muscle. It was limited only by the strength of the beam and the chain. That is why one operator working the tackle could raise what a quinquereme weighed, a warship that, fully manned, likely displaced on the order of 50 tons, and why the Romans could not simply overwhelm it with more soldiers or heavier ships. A heavier ship was just a heavier thing for the pulleys to lift, and the pulleys had already been designed to lift the unliftable. The floating siege tower, the sambuca, the pride of Marcellus's naval plan, was reportedly destroyed by exactly this kind of machine, either seized and capsized or crushed by dropped stones before it ever reached the wall. The most expensive weapon in the Roman fleet was made useless in its first hour. Anchor this back to Marcellus for a moment. He had come with a two-front plan, sea and land, and the seafront was supposed to be the fast one. Instead, his heaviest ships were being plucked out of the water one at a time, and his men had begun to believe the wall was alive. Now let me apply this same mechanical logic to 3 other moments of the siege, because the claw was not a single trick. It was one expression of a total system, and the system caught the Romans no matter what they tried. Consider the sea assault first, the one Marcellus led in person. His plan depended on getting his ships close to the wall to use the sambuca and the ladders. But Archimedes had built the wall batteries in 2 tiers precisely to deny that approach. As the Roman ships came in from open water, large stone-throwing catapults, engines that could hurl rocks weighing as much as a fully grown man, opened on them at long range. Ships were holed and swamped before they were anywhere near the wall. Those that pushed through the long-range fire and closed the distance discovered the second tier. Set low in the wall were rows of smaller, rapid engines, what the sources call scorpions, firing iron bolts through loopholes at ships now only yards away. And beyond those, the claw. There was no gap in the coverage. Far out, the boulders. Closer in, the bolts. At the wall itself, the iron hand. Marcellus had planned for a weak point in the harbor defenses. Archimedes had engineered the harbor to have no weak point at all.
The consul called off the sea assault.
60 of the finest warships in the world, driven back not by a fleet, but by a coastline. Consider the land assault, the second front. Marcellus turned to the landward walls, thinking the machines were a naval problem. There, he met the same layered principle rendered for dry ground. The heavy catapults threw stone against the massed infantry approaching in formation. As the Romans came closer and tried to shelter under their shields and against the base of the wall, believing themselves under the arc of the big engines and therefore safe, Archimedes had prepared for exactly that thought. Smaller ports had been cut low in the wall, and through them the scorpions fired at point-blank range into men who had assumed they were in a dead zone. And where soldiers reached the very foot of the wall with ladders, the beams swung out overhead and dropped stones and lumps of lead straight down onto them, or dropped the iron hand onto a raised ladder and its climbers. Every distance the Roman infantry could occupy had a weapon assigned to it.
The genius was not any one engine.
The genius was that Archimedes had divided the entire battlefield into zones and given its own answer. Now consider the psychological collapse, because this is the third example and the one that changed the character of the whole war. Livy and Plutarch both describe what happened to the Roman army after these repulses. The soldiers stopped believing they were fighting a city. They began to believe they were fighting Archimedes personally. It reached the point, Plutarch says, that if the Romans saw so much as a length of rope or a piece of timber appear over the wall, they turned and ran, shouting that Archimedes was aiming some new engine at them.
Marcellus, a proud man, was reduced to grim jokes about the old geometer who sat drinking seawater from the Roman ships with his cranes and had shamed the entire fleet. And then Marcellus made the decision that tells you how completely the machines had won. He gave up on storming Syracuse. He ordered his army to stop attacking. The most aggressive commander Rome had would besiege the city by blockade instead, by sitting down around it and waiting, because every attempt to take it by force had cost him ships and men and gained him nothing. One man's engineering had converted a planned 2-week storm into a siege that would last the better part of 3 years. Now I owe you the burning mirrors because I promised you the truth about them, and the truth is not what most people have been told. The story goes that Archimedes arranged polished bronze mirrors along the wall, focused the sun's rays onto Roman ships, and set them alight at a distance. It is one of the most famous stories in the history of science. And here is where the ancient record splits in a way you need to hear clearly. Polybius, the earliest and most reliable source, the man closest to the events, does not mention the mirrors at all. Neither does Livy.
neither does Plutarch. The heat ray story appears only in much later writers, centuries after the siege, long after the events had passed into legend. That timing matters. The machines that Polybius does describe, the claw and the catapults, are mechanically sound and were reported almost immediately. The mirrors appear only after the story had generations to grow. The engineering deepens the doubt. To ignite ship's timber with focused sunlight, you need mirrors of considerable size and precision, all aimed at a single moving target at the same instant, held steady, on a ship that is pitching on the water and, crucially, not simply rowing out of the beam. Modern attempts to reproduce the effect have wrestled with all of these problems, and the honest verdict is that under ideal, still, close conditions, you might char wood and produce smoke, but setting a moving warship ablaze across the water is at the outer edge of possibility, and probably beyond it.
So the most defensible reading is this. Archimedes almost certainly did not burn the Roman fleet with mirrors. The story that reaches us is a later flowering of a real reputation. But there is a subtler possibility worth stating because it fits the man. Archimedes understood optics and reflection better than anyone of his age. Even the ability to dazzle and blind enemy crews with concentrated glare, to ruin their aim and their nerve at a critical moment, would have been well within reach. The legend of the death ray may be a magnified memory of a real trick of light. What the physical evidence does not support is fire. What the physical evidence does support is that this was a man his enemies believed capable of anything, which was itself a weapon. So if the machines were unbeatable, how did Syracuse fall? Here is the fourth thing I promised, the layered defense paying off into the fifth, the single failure that ended it. And the answer is almost unbearable in its ordinariness. Syracuse was not taken by a better siege engine. It was taken by a festival and a wall left unwatched. For almost 3 years, Marcellus blockaded the city, and for almost 3 years the walls held. But a blockade is a patient thing, and it works on the mind of the defender as surely as on the body. In the year 212 before the Common Era, the Syracusans held a festival to the goddess Artemis. Wine flowed. Discipline slackened. A section of the wall that should have been fully manned was thinly held by men who had celebrated too well. Marcellus had prisoners and deserters who knew the ground, and from them he learned the height of a particular stretch of wall near a tower, and that on the night of the festival it would be lightly guarded. He had ladders built to exactly that height. On the festival night, a picked body of Roman soldiers went over that wall in the dark, cut down the drowsy sentries, opened a gate from within, and let the army in. Not one of Archimedes' machines failed. The machines were never even brought to bear. The wall that fell was the one no engineer can design against. The wall guarded by tired, drunk, distracted men. Once the Romans were inside, the layered brilliance of the defense meant nothing. The catapults faced outward. The claw reached over the seawall toward an enemy who was now behind it, in the streets. The greatest defensive system of the ancient world was undone in a single night by human carelessness, and the whole of Archimedes' genius, 3 years of holding an empire at bay, ended not with a mechanical failure, but with a hangover. And here is the order Marcellus gave, the one I promised you at the start. When the city fell, Marcellus, who had come to hate and to admire Archimedes in equal measure across 3 years of humiliation, gave a specific command. The old man was to be taken alive and unharmed. Whatever fury the consul felt, he understood he was capturing the greatest mind of the age,
and he wanted him. But battlefield orders and the chaos of a sacked city are two different things.
The most repeated account says a Roman soldier came upon Archimedes bent over a diagram he had drawn in the sand or on a tray of dust, so absorbed in a geometry problem that he barely registered the sword. "Do not disturb my circles," he is said to have told the soldier, and the soldier, in anger or fear, killed him. Marcellus, we are told, was grieved, treated the death almost as a personal loss, and saw to it that Archimedes was buried with honor. On the tomb, at Archimedes' own earlier wish, they carved a sphere inside a cylinder, marking not a weapon or a victory, but a piece of pure mathematics he considered his finest achievement. The man who had stopped Rome for 3 years wanted to be remembered for a theorem. There is one thread in this story that the arms race framing lets us follow to its end, and it is the part that turns Syracuse from a curiosity into a turning point. Rome did not simply lose ships at Syracuse and shrug. Rome studied what had happened. Marcellus learned, at appalling cost, that a determined defender armed with superior engineering could neutralize numbers and courage entirely, that you cannot storm a wall that has been designed as a machine. And so Rome adapted. Roman siege doctrine after Syracuse leaned harder into exactly what beat Archimedes in the end: patience, blockade, intelligence, and the exploitation of the defender's human weakness rather than a head-on contest of engines. The lesson Rome carried away was not that machines do not matter. It was that the will and discipline of the men behind the wall matter more, and that even the finest engineering in the world is only as strong as the least attentive sentry on the least important night. That is the real reason the siege of Syracuse still matters. It is not just the spectacle of the claw lifting ships from the sea or the legend of mirrors and fire. It is the demonstration, as clean as one of Archimedes' own proofs, that a single mind, given time to prepare and the freedom to design, can hold off the most powerful war machine on Earth. For nearly 3 years, one man in his 70s who had never led a soldier turned the walls of his city into a weapon that made consuls despair and legions run from a coil of rope. Rome conquered the Mediterranean. But at Syracuse, for a long and humiliating time, Rome could not conquer geometry. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the overlooked engineering and the strange, decisive moments that changed how wars were fought, subscribe and hit the like button so the next investigation reaches you. There are more of these than you would think, and I will see you at the next one.